Hello, folks. Today, I am recording a walkthrough of the FRQ from last week, which was a review FRQ on limiting majority rule. So this was a concept application FRQ. So just like we've done in weeks past, when you are finished watching this video, you will, if you choose, complete your revisions on a Google Doc and upload it to the assignment for Monday, May 4th. Okay, so as you're watching this video, I recommend you have your original writing from, let's see, that would be Thursday, April 30th, up in another tab. So that way you can see my suggestions and then how you originally responded. So let's go ahead and just talk about the writing tips for concept application really quickly. Always remember to answer the verb. So identify is one sentence. You don't need to elaborate or explain. Describing is a little bit more in depth, right? You're providing relevant characteristics on the topic, usually 1 to 2 sentences. And then explain. Make sure when you explain, you're defining all relevant terms, using the word because. Usually this is a paragraph and you're elaborating and providing evidence, okay? Sometimes with concept applications, you're given a new scenario. Make sure you are always relating your answer back to the prompt, okay? And remember, all words in the prompt matter. Make sure you're closing the loop and kind of rephrasing or restating what the original question was asking. And then pacing yourself. You will get 15 minutes for this type of FRQ on the exam on May 11th. It will go quickly. So make sure that you are timing your revisions as well. Okay, so let's take a look at our prompt. In Federalist Paper number 10, James Madison expressed concern over the possibility that both majority and minority factions would have too much power over government, and he presented ways of minimizing that danger. The U.S. Constitution established a democratic government, but also contained several provisions that limited majority rule. Throughout the next 2 centuries, the role of majority rule in the United States government and politics continued to change. And then you'll respond to A, B, and C below. Okay, so one of the first things to know is make sure you know what factions are. Right, those are those groups in government. We often think of factions as interest groups, okay, competing interests, right? Now, Madison, okay, you don't need to use Fed 10 in your writing, but it is important to note that Madison was fearful of factions. Factions are not good, according to Madison, but he also realizes that they are inevitable, okay? They are impossible to get rid of because if you are eliminating factions, these opinions and interests in society, you are by nature eliminating liberty, okay? So his Fed 10 lists particularly some ways that the Constitution minimizes the danger of majority rule and the dangers of factions, okay? So you have to keep that in mind for some context as you're going through A, B, and C. Okay, so let's talk about A. A is asking you to do 2 things. So it's a 2-point question. You have to identify the part of the national government that was originally most closely tied to citizens and explain how it was tied to citizens. So you cannot just list the part of the national government here and get a point. Well, you can get a point, but you won't get full credit, I should say, okay? So when it's asking you to identify, remember, this is asking you for 1 simple sentence. So we know that from our study of all of the institutions of government, that the part of the national government that was originally most closely tied to citizens was the House of Representatives and Congress. Or I should say, or Congress. Now, I think that the House of Representatives is probably the better of the 2 answers. And you'll see why when we look at these options here. You can say Congress. College Board acknowledges that Congress is an appropriate answer. I just think it's a little bit weaker, okay? So you would get credit for Congress, but know that House of Representatives is probably better. Okay. Now, you then have to explain, right? You've, in a complete sentence, listed the part of the national government that was most closely tied to citizens. Now you have to explain how. So this is where you're going to elaborate, give examples, and provide evidence. Okay. So one reason, right? One thing you would say next is one reason for this, right? The House/Congress being so closely tied to citizens is that. Okay, and there are a couple of different options that you can pick. I didn't elaborate on all of them, but just to give you an example, you could say that the House of Representatives is directly elected by the people, unlike the president. Okay, and it always has been. In the original Constitution, the House of Representatives was the only part of our national government that is elected directly by the people. Okay. The president is not, because it's the Electoral College. You could even mention that. And until the passage of the 17th Amendment, the House was more directly elected than the Senate, right? So that's why I'm saying Congress is a little bit tricky. You'd have to specify the House of Representatives anyway, because the Senate, which is another part of Congress, was not originally directly elected by the people. Instead, it was chosen by the state legislatures. Something else you could say here, the shorter term length of the House of Representatives ties them to the people, right? The House of Representatives has 2-year terms versus the Senate's 6. And then you would go on and say, this is because, right, shorter terms connects them more to the people because people or the representatives have to listen to public opinion more if they want to be reelected, right? There's more pressure to conform to public opinion, thereby tying them to the will of the people more than any other branch of the government, okay? Now, if you wanted to go the congressional route, you could say members of Congress must live in the state that they represent, right? If you live in the state they represent, they have to be in tune with the will of their constituency in their state. And then along those same lines, you could talk about how House members represent relatively small districts, right? Districts are obviously smaller than a state. There are a smaller number of people that they represent. So you could elaborate on how that connects them to the citizenship, okay? All right, part B is again another question with 2 points. So you have to explain, elaborate, give details, and provide evidence 2 ways that the Constitution limits majority rule. So do you see why it's so important to know those documents inside and out? You have to be able, within a 15-minute time span, to rattle off a couple of different ways that they limit this concept of majority rule. And you do need to know what this concept is. If you go on talking about racial majority and racial minorities, that's not correct. We're talking about political majorities and minorities here, okay? So you would start off your paragraph in some way like this, in a complete sentence. The framers of the Constitution implemented several provisions to limit majority rule and protect minority rights in the political process. One way is, okay? So you do have to list 2. Now, this is not an exhaustive list. There are probably other answers that I have not included here. I just wanted to go through a few of them, okay? So the first thing that you need to do is basically identify, even though it doesn't say to, you should identify so that way your reader knows what provisions you're talking about, okay? So once you then pick your ways that the Constitution limits majority rule, you then have to explain. Okay, you can't just say the Electoral College is a provision that limits majority rule. Excuse me. You have to explain, how does that limit majority rule? Okay, so for example, one way is the Electoral College. This is basically you would say this is a provision of the Constitution that provides a way of indirectly selecting a president through electors of each state. Right? And you could talk about how the framers were very wary of tyranny of the majority. They were not trusting of popular opinion. Through this system, it is possible that the candidate who wins the popular vote will not win in the Electoral College, thus limiting the influence of the people or the majority. And you could even cite a couple of examples here to show that you understand this process. This happened in Bush v. Gore and Trump v. Clinton. Okay, Clinton and Gore won the popular vote, but Trump and Bush won the Electoral College, right, as a limit on majority rule. Okay, you could talk about U.S. senators originally being selected by state legislators, right, insulating them more from public opinion. You could talk about the longer terms of senators and elaborate on how that limits majority rule. The independent judiciary with life terms is something else you could cite, right? This provides so that the Supreme Court is not connected to the other two branches, insulating them from public opinion, ensuring that their decisions can never be swayed by the majority. The Constitution also establishes a representative form of government, okay, giving power, policymaking not to the people, but to the representatives that they elect, right? We don't have a direct democracy. We have a representative democracy to prevent that from happening. You could talk about checks and balances. An example here would be absolutely wonderful, right? A majority of Congress may pass a law, but the president could veto it, thus limiting the majority rule of Congress. Now, one thing to note, please be careful here. You couldn't say judicial review as a provision of the Constitution. And I know that that sounds weird, but remember, judicial review is not a provision of the Constitution. It was really established via Marbury versus Madison, and judicial review is not mentioned in the Constitution. So just something to be wary of. You could talk about bicameralism here, right? Bicameralism makes it possible for a bill to pass in one chamber, but not in the other, right? It prevents small and large states from receiving an unfair advantage in representation, thus lessening the chance of a majority when it comes to state interest, okay? You could even talk about the Bill of Rights. As I said, this is not an exhaustive list, but as you can see, there are a multitude of ways that the Constitution itself limits majority rule. Okay, and then finally, part C, again, was a two-part question. You had to choose two of the following, okay, not three. I know there are three listed, so you need to pay attention to all of the wording in the question. Sometimes they will ask you or make you do all of them. Sometimes you get to pick, okay, so make sure that you're paying attention. I suggest going with your gut. If you see this in a question where you get to pick, two will probably be easier to discuss than the other, okay? So for this particular question, you need to choose two of the following 20th century developments and explain how each moved the US from a less democratic system to a more democratic system. Now, applying some history here, 20th century developments, these are all regarding the progressive era. All of these are happening in the progressive era where political corruption abounded. So if you can remember that, you're already a step ahead because you can probably think about how these would make it more democratic, okay, which is what you have to answer. Again, explaining. Make sure to define the term and explain how it makes our government more democratic. You will not earn the point if you just define the term, okay? When you are selecting your characteristics, I would bold if you can, just to make them stand out. Okay, and again, you'll want to define key terms. So I did all three. You do not have to do all three. Okay, so the first one that is on here are primary elections. Okay, I say the addition of primary elections in the 20th century moved the United States from a less democratic system to a more democratic system. Automatically know that I am going to be talking about primary elections. The next thing I'm going to do is define. Primary elections are preliminary elections that give the electorate the power to vote and decide which of the party's candidates will become their nominee in the general election. Boom, I showed the reader what I know what I'm talking about. Prior to this process being put in place, I think that's a good strategy, talking about what was it like before to then show how the process is more democratic because of this. Okay, so prior to this process being put in place, political parties had most of the impact in selecting a party's nominee. As a result of the primary election, this is where I close the loop and earn the point, because I'm going to describe how it changed the process to make it more democratic. This control was taken away from political parties and given to the voters. This expanded people's power in choosing their candidates for office, thus making the US more democratic. So I've closed the loop, right? Talking about how it is more democratic, what it was like before versus now, okay? The 17th Amendment is another option. So prior to the 17th Amendment, US senators were originally chosen by state legislatures, i.e., those already in a position of political power. So you can use that to talk about corruption. This created a system of elitism, great vocab word, and corruption. With the passing of the 17th Amendment, it was now mandated that US senators be directly elected by the people. So that's what it did, defining it. This amendment made the US more democratic because, now I'm about ready to explain, because it expanded the power of the citizen to influence their representation in Congress, as well as have a greater impact on policymaking as a result. Right? If you have more influence on your representation, you have a greater impact on how those people make policy. Okay? Again, describing how it changes the process to make it more democratic. Then we have the expansion of suffrage. So the 20th century saw a significant expansion of suffrage to previously disenfranchised groups. That's another great way to show what you're talking about. This was done primarily through amendments to the Constitution and acts of Congress. So this is a great way to provide some examples. Okay? For example, women gained the right to vote with the 19th Amendment. The voting age was lowered to 18-year-olds after the Vietnam War with the 26th Amendment. Racial minorities saw expanded suffrage with the removal of the poll tax via the 24th Amendment, and other barriers to voting with the Voting Rights Act of 1965. Those are so many examples there to show what the expansion of suffrage, or what it is, and when it happened during the 20th century. Okay? This expansion of suffrage made the US more democratic because it led to a more representative electorate. Now those eligible to vote were of even more racial, gendered, and socioeconomic backgrounds than ever before. Again, showing how it changed and made the process more democratic. This gave more people a voice in directing the government to reflect the broad interests of the citizenry, which is a hallmark of democracy. So this is another way then to close the loop. Again, talking about the primary focus of democracy and showing how this connects to it. Okay, and that is it. That is a 6-point question. So if you guys have any questions on this walkthrough, if there's anything that you had that you are still questioning would be correct, make sure to reach out, and I will talk to you guys soon. Bye.